Welcome to the Caribbean Edge. My name is Dawn Wilson. I'm your host this evening. Thank you for joining us. And I want to welcome back to the Caribbean Edge, Mr. Christian White. Hi, Christian. How are you?
I'm doing excellent, Dawn. Thank you for having me back for a second time.
You're so welcome. So for those of you that have not seen the fatherhood episode, I encourage you to check that out. Quite an awesome episode, just sitting around chatting with four dads, four different journeys that you're able to share with us. So thank you for joining us. And we're starting a series right now, Against All Odds, just talking to people that have truly been through so much, unbelievable. And I'm a firm believer that you can learn so much through conversation and through personal experiences, even more so than a book, because it's real, it's life, and it's someone's journey. And so I am so honored that you're joining me so we can really dig in and talk about your journey. And so I know that you started one day at a time, Dad. Mm-hmm. And you're also, a quote from you is from single cell to single dad.
Yes.
So I want to take you all the way through life. I want to talk about your childhood. So tell me about mom and dad. Tell me about your parents.
So my mom, probably the easiest because she wasn't around once I was born. So we can start with that. That was the easiest. I didn't meet my mom till I was 13 years old. So for the first 13 years of life, she was just an imaginary character that I knew existed somewhere. And I remember I used to really yearn for her. Like I really wanted my mom, like badly. My dad, an interesting character. If I look at it from a childhood perspective, I would just say he was a horrible father. If I look at it from my perspective now, I can see where he needed healing and didn't attempt that. So there's sort of that balance where when I look at my parents now, I sort of have sort of like a mercy for them. Yet at the same time, they weren't the best parents, and that should be acknowledged. So my dad was verbally abusive, once in a while physically abusive, emotionally unavailable, and he drank often. He did marry, so I did have a stepmother for many years, but they would break up often, and in the middle of that, he would be with whoever he felt he fell in love with at that moment. So there was a lot of moving around. There was a lot of mixed messages that good at explaining to us, my siblings and I, so we had to figure a lot of things out by ourselves.
Okay. And how many siblings do you have?
In total, I'm the middle of 11. But I grew up specifically mostly with two other siblings, an older brother and an older sister. And the rest were kind of scattered throughout.
Okay. So I know you mentioned previously that you were molested.
Yes.
Okay. So at what age did that happen? And by a relative, a friend, stranger?
So it was by a close family member. And it began around the ages of 3.5, and it went on till about 12.5.
So at 3.5 years old, when you are unable to protect and defend yourself, as you got older, were your parents aware of this? Or how do you know it happened at 3.5 years old?
Because I can remember that far back.
Wow.
I was a very interesting child. So by the age of 3, I could read full books. I was very, very inquisitive. I was very aware, very curious, very vibrant, very bubbly, very outgoing. And slowly over the years, the abuse just kind of took that all away.
Okay. And so when did it stop? From 3.5
till about 12 and a half.
Okay. And I am so sorry that you went through this, and I'm glad that you are sharing it, because so many men and women don't share this, and it's so uncomfortable. And
But I do want to point out, historically speaking, it's especially harder for men. I won't say harder for men, but there's so much more stigma around toxic masculinity and men being a particular way, only showing particular feelings and emotions, which are violent anger, rage, wrath, things that we would look at as dominant, protective. So I want to be clear. From what I know, the last that was reported, 2 out of every 8 boys have been sexually abused. Yet we know that that's just what's reported. I myself have met many people like me who have never spoken about it, but heard my story and spoke to me about it. I mean, so I think it should be acknowledged that, one, boys are molested, boys are violated. And I think where we sometimes lose track is we tend to look at these boys as if they're somehow men, when the reality is we're talking about children, period.
right. So why did it stop? Why did it stop? Why did the molester stop doing that to you?
It was a choice that they made to stop it at that moment. And it had very devastating effects on me.
Okay. So have you spoken to this person at all through the years that they know?
Oh, yes.
I want to know, was the person charged?
So no. So there's no criminal aspect to the situation, because that it wasn't age appropriate in that sense. So it's like you often think of like children. I mean, and so, in when we were growing up, healthy children play house. There's a point in time where children are discovering themselves, all of themselves. But try to think of this discovery of self gone horribly wrong for a very long time.
Okay. So what would you say to people that may be in a similar situation? What advice would you give to people?
So it's always difficult, because it's hard not to give people advice from what I understand now.
Okay.
Because I've personally done a lot of work on myself, and there's still a lot to do, but I'm very proud of what I have done. So what I try to keep in mind is that so many people might be hearing this, becoming aware of this, being triggered by it their very first time. So first and foremost, if you are triggered by anything that I'm speaking of, or any question that Dawn may ask, stop watching. That's if you don't have a safe space, supportive person around you, somebody you can reach out to, for the moment, stop watching. It's enough to know that you heard something that made you think so deeply about something. That's the first and foremost thing. There's no need to trigger yourself too badly if this is your first time dealing with this situation. So for those who have sort of been aware of something they may have been through, acknowledged it, and just may not know steps to take, the first thing that I did for me was to speak out about it. So I spoke out about it once when I was a child, and I was shut down for doing so. And I stayed shut down after that, probably for about 9 or 10 years.
Who did you speak out to?
I spoke about it to my dad. And so my dad, and this was in 5th grade. And I spoke to my dad, and I assumed that, my dad, he would treat the person just like he treated us when he was mad. And so there was several incidences of me being abused by different people. So this specific incident involved my teacher. And this was in the 80s. This was years ago. Policies are much different now. Sexual abuse is a topic that is much more in the media. People are willing to hear it, willing to talk about it. At my point in time growing up, it was still a very quiet matter. And so when I spoke up about the teacher, so my dad brought me to school the next day, something that wouldn't happen today, obviously. We went to the principal's office. I told the principal what had been going on, and they called the teacher into the room. And to be clear, this would not happen today. Protections for children are much different, much more stringent. People take things still as seriously, but with different understandings now. That is probably not best to sit a child down in a room with the person they're saying did something to them. So thankfully, things have evolved past that. And so the teacher came into the room, and I just started crying. I couldn't stop crying. And so my dad was yelling at me, because when growing up in my house, you weren't allowed to cry. It was a no-no. You got hit for crying, which defeated the purpose of not crying, because being hit made you cry more. And so I'm in the office, I'm crying, and I am crying. And my dad's like, well, just tell everybody what happened. You just told us. But I couldn't stop crying. And so my dad grabbed me by the ear, and he twisted it. It was what he did to us. One of the things he did when we were younger. And, it hurt so bad, I just had to go with it. And he said, the stupid motherfucker must have been lying anyway. And from that moment, I was about 7 or 8. From that moment, I knew that I would never speak again. And it remained that way till about age 18.
I'm so appalled, and I'm so happy you're sharing it, but I'm so appalled because I can't imagine, no matter what era you are in life, that as parents and your children come to you, and you think of what it must take, the strength that kids take, the courage to come and disclose this, that someone has hurt them, that as parents, we don't believe it. And I know I don't speak for all parents. I just can't imagine not believing one of my children if they came forward. So I'm glad the laws and the rules have changed, and there's so much more awareness. A lot more needs to be done to protect our children. Yes, there's a few false claims out there, but regardless, it's not a reason not to believe your children. And you should be having these conversations with them at an early stage in life so that your children can come to you, because you'll never be with your kids 100% of the time, but they need to be able to trust you enough that you will handle it, because that's what you're there for, to protect your children.
No, absolutely. And to add to that, so I'm a big advocate for parents. I'm a big advocate of promoting healthy parenting. So what I've come to find, and this is just within the sort of few years I've been becoming more involved with parents, ever since I became a full-time parent about 4 years ago. In retrospect, and from what I have learned about my father's own history, he had experienced I'll never make an excuse for him. But what I will say to parents, and it's something that I had to learn over the course of years, is part of our duty as a parent is continuing to work on ourselves as individuals.
Yeah.
And that's something that I have learned throughout this journey. So for somebody like my dad, for somebody like my mom, for so many of the moms and dads that I saw in my community and communities that mirrored my community, so many of us were frozen in time. We experienced certain traumas. We went through certain experiences and we stayed stuck there. We stayed stuck. And just because we're stuck, it doesn't mean that life is not still going on. So we're still working, we're still reproducing, we're still coping, which is what I understand my parents were doing their whole life. And what I did for most of my life was cope enough to get by and not go crazy. And it doesn't take away the fact that because of their decisions, they directly failed at parenting. On some levels, my dad probably was doing his best, but it wasn't good enough. And it was on him to be good enough and not on us. Yeah. So for me as a parent, I try to be aware of when I'm stuck in a certain mind state when it comes to Christian, when it comes to my regular life, because I want to ever be evolving and learning new ways to be a better me, which automatically means being a better parent.
Yeah, and I hear you 100%. And I've seen that. I know we get stuck, especially, I think, if I look back at my family history, the previous generations, it's like that stuck. And so, if they were disciplined a certain way, they pass that on to you. So at what point do you break the cycle? At what point as an individual do you say, it happened to me and it hurt me so much that I can't do this to my own kid? And it's just not right. And I guess I can have that mindset, but once again, I can't speak for anyone else that has chosen to continue some of these harsh and awful things to children. So once again, thank you for that. And like you said, no excuses for your dad. I make none for my dad whatsoever because I've broken my cycles as well. Let's talk about, I know you had the opportunity at some point to stay with your aunt and uncle, I believe.
Yes.
Okay. Are you still
when I was
them?
Yes. So they're my biggest support system by far. So when I was 13, so what I've noticed is for my life, the age of 12 to 13 was like a pivotal. So the way that I kept track of time when I was young is because the abnormal had become normal, I began to keep track of time when something extremely abnormal happened. So me keeping time as a young child, everything was looked at sort of in one block, and something had to be totally different in a bad way or an unhealthy way for me to be able to mark it as a moment in time. So 12 to 13 was probably my biggest transition in life in terms of ways that I had grown accustomed to being ripped out from under me and having no frame of reference to rebuild from. And so when I was 13, my dad sat me down and he told me flat out that he couldn't afford me anymore, so I had to leave. And obviously shocked, obviously anything you could imagine feeling at that time. And so we were given two options. We could live with my uncle and aunt who lived in Boston, or we could live with our biological mom, whom we had just met a month before that. So we chose to live with my uncle and aunt because at least if we were going to be somewhere, it might as well be in Massachusetts. So I ended up moving in with them when I was 13. So in Massachusetts, the State Department was called Department of Social Services at the time. It's now called Department of Children and Family Services. And what they did was it's called a CHINS, a Child in Need of Services. They gave my uncle and aunt a 6-month temporary guardianship to see what it would be like. It was kind of like the experimental phase. So once the 6 months was up, we went back to court for an assessment, and I told them that I needed to be placed in a foster home. So I was put in the foster care system at that point.
Why did you tell them that, though? If you were in a loving home, why do you think you told them that?
Well, let me ask you a question. Why did you ask that question?
Because you're living with your aunt and uncle. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming it's a safe environment because they're your biggest supporters, you mentioned. And you went back and said, put me back in the fosters, in the system. Mm-hmm. Why not stay with family?
So, first and foremost, all of the pain that I ever knew in life came through family. So I think it's important to keep in mind that even by the age of 6, even by the age of 7, my mind was already so far gone. I was so used to how I was treated that the biggest threat in the world was somebody who actually loved me in a healthy way. Right. Because somebody who loved me in a healthy way had the potential to actually hurt me on the deepest levels, as opposed to just my physical body. So remember, I had already promised myself that I would never talk again. I would never try to attempt healing or bringing awareness to a situation. So when I'm faced with two people who are providing stability, who are providing a healthy love, who want to nurture me, in my 13-year-old mind, all I heard was, get the F out of there. If you want to protect your own emotions, then you need to get away. So yes, on the face of it, and it's funny, the reason why I asked you that is because it's a very typical response. So I remember when my social worker found out that I wanted to be put in the foster care system, the first thing he said to me was, you're going to be dead in the gutter before you're 17. And so I looked at him at that time like, he's probably right. But the reality is, there's a whole backstory that we have before we're put in any new thing. Nobody happened to know my backstory. So it is natural for somebody who is accustomed to unhealthy love to want to have no involvement with healthy love.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Difficult questions, but have to ask. And I completely understand what you're saying. I definitely get it. And I hope the viewers get it as well. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Because we can't understand the mindset if you haven't gone through it yourself. And so now you're back in the foster system. What happens next?
Well, I'm in the foster care system for the first time.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And what's next for you?
So what's next comes is I end up So I went to several foster homes. I couldn't adjust well at all, mostly because the foster parents were trying to show me some sort of affection and emotion. So I could not handle that at all from anybody. But I craved it nevertheless. So it was always a sort of confusion going on, where naturally I knew I needed to be loved. I needed to be guided. I needed to be shown the world. I needed these things, as all children do, as all people do. But I was so used to one way. And at least in the foster care system, so from the foster homes, I ended up going to several assessment programs, which ended me in going to residential facilities, what we would know as group homes, things of that nature. And at least it provided a small level of some of the abuses that I had grown to love. So at least it put me in a position to be able to experience some of the dysfunctional. By this time in my life, I had to have. So the foster care system did that for a few years. What ended up happening was, when I was 16, I was in a program. Sorry, when I was 14, I was in a program, and something had happened where my biological mom, we were reunited again. So I met her when I was 13. And then we started talking again when she was living in Kentucky at the time. So I started talking to her, and we decided that I would move down there. It was like totally random, totally a shock to everybody. But it was something that I could do to get out of the program that I was in. I wanted to get out of this particular program. And so you needed a house to go to. So I ended up going to Kentucky, and I ended up getting a job at Taco Bell. And after a few weeks, an incident happened where something happened with my mom, and she kicked me out. She had me sleeping on the porch. And it was very traumatizing because I had already felt like she abandoned me the first time when I was born. So when I was born, my mom was 18 and I was her 5th child. So that tells you a lot right there. She had her first child at 11, and it just didn't stop after that. So you can imagine whatever was mixed up in her going on. And so my mom wouldn't let me in the house. And what she was going through was totally unrelated to me, had nothing to do with me. But it reaffirmed for me that all of the problems in the world were somehow my fault. So I owned these certain identities for many years. But there were very clear moments that made me realize just how messed up life was going. And that was one of those moments when I went to Kentucky. She ended up having me sleep on the porch. When I got my first paycheck from Taco Bell, it was like $96, I think. And I bought a bus ticket back to Boston. And I came back to Boston and was just sleeping in my friend's basement for a while.
I can't imagine. I can't imagine you sleeping on the porch and everything else. And your mom's inside the house. I can't connect with it at all. So now you're back in Boston, and how did you end up in the streets, in the gangs?
So when I first moved in with my uncle and aunt live in a section of Boston called Roxbury. And the specific neighborhood that they live in is called Grove Hall. And the smaller neighborhood of that would be called Humboldt Avenue. So in Boston, what usually happens as a young boy growing up is you usually end up becoming a part of the neighborhood you grew up in. So the word gang is more of a construct given to groups of young men by the system, by the authorities, by the police. But the reality is we were a bunch of young men who didn't have much to do. Society didn't accept us. Our parents, for the most part, didn't accept huge parts of us. And a lot of it is whether they were on drugs, whether they were working, we were left to raise ourselves. And seeing a world that didn't accept you, but at the same time told you to build an American dream, you found a way to create a family within the environment you were in. And we got a lot of things wrong. A lot of things wrong. But at the same time, what would you expect?
So tell me, what was that life like? What were some of the things that you did?
So for me, the streets absolutely saved my life. And why I say that is, so if I think about the way my life was going, so as soon as I'm born, I go right into surgery. I had heart murmurs and I had a valve closed, so they had to perform a tracheotomy. So my first coming into the world was met with violence right away, going into surgery. Moments after that, my mom decided she would not be sticking around. My dad ended up coming to the hospital. Him and my uncle, the one that I'm talking about, they ended up bringing me home. I ended up staying with my dad. Not too long after staying with my dad, the abuse starts. Not by my dad, but the abuse in general starts. That goes on for a decade. Right after that, I go into the system. Right after that is when I'm introduced sort of to the gang life. So there was never a chance for me to have a relationship with myself or others, but in a very limited way. So when I was introduced to the street life, it was much different than the life I had known. So there was certain when I was in the streets, I can't even recall anybody talking about being abused sexually, any sexual abuse going on in any of our circles, families, anything like that. There were other issues going on, issues more related directly to the street life. So I took on new issues, which brought me away from the older issues, which was a blessing, a huge blessing. So even though I was now in a new world where I was self-destructing in new ways, mostly through violence, because I always wanted to be validated. I always wanted attention. I always wanted to be loved. I always wanted to be remembered. I always wanted to belong. I always wanted to protect. Excuse me. I always wanted to be protected. Like, just because you're in any particular environment, your wants and needs are the same as any other human beings in any environment. So it's no different in the street life. It's just that some of the consequences that come with some of the choices can be very deadly. So I mean, for myself in the streets, like I said, violence was very much promoted. Violence in some to a form of love. The more violent you could be, the more you were acknowledged. the more people spoke of you, the more people wanted to take the time to understand you. So I was very good at it. I was very good at it often. And it led me down a path that eventually I spent 17 years in and out of prison and jails and mental institutions because of a lot of the choices that I made.
Can you elaborate on some of the things that you've done that you wish you hadn't done? You know, because I'm sure you've hurt so many people along the way. What were some of those things that you did?
Well, I won't talk specific details in that sense, mostly because if anybody that I have heard connects to that story, that's for their story to tell. That's not for me to tell their story. With that said, while I do not believe in harming people, I wouldn't change anything about my life. Not one thing. So I don't have regrets in the sense that I just wish it never happened. Like it happened for a reason. And I make sense of it now, and I become a better person once I know certain behaviors are wrong. But I want to be very clear. When it comes to the ways that we survive, and these are survival mechanisms, what a lot of people don't understand is you're going to adapt and survive according to the environment that you are living in, that you're raised in, that you're a part of. So in my neighborhood, so when I was growing up in my household, survival mechanisms usually involve something that was hypersexualized. In the street life, survival mechanisms usually were represented through violence. And in your world, it was represented another way. In another world, it may have been therapy. It really depended on the world you were in. And so for me, I've found myself on both ends of the trigger. I've been on one side of the gun, and I've been on the other side of the gun. So, and this has been several times throughout my life. So for me, when I look at what I have done in life, I can understand why I do certain things. Now, to other people, they might not ever take the time to understand why I do something. They don't have to. I'll never be upset with anybody that's mad at me for something that I've done, or I'm always open to conversation with people that I've harmed. So, I mean, I don't have regrets. I never want to see another human being hurting. But I 100% understand that in those moments and times, there was absolutely no other option available to me. And that is the case for so many of us, because we simply do not know another way. I wasn't raised to be a brother, a father, a son, a cousin, a friend, an uncle. I was raised to be a young, I won't say the N word, but I was raised to be the N word in an inner city around so much poverty, around so much corruption, around so much drugs. And I adapted to the environment I was in and tried to make the best life out of that environment. And that's a very harsh but sad reality.
Okay. So you were shot at what age?
I was 16 when I was shot.
16. And from what I understand, you almost lost your life then.
Yes. So I was shot underneath the arm, and it came out the front of my chest. Yes.
Okay. And then you went to prison or jail, correct?
So I was shot at 16. I was shot in October. By that January, so my birthday's in December. So I turned 17 in December. the following January, I was arrested for a homicide in Boston, yes. So I went to Nashua Street Jail, which is the local county jail in Suffolk County, and I awaited trial for 19 months. And I went to trial, and I was ultimately found not guilty.
Okay, so how did you end up in prison? Let's fast forward now. You were sentenced to 10 years in prison?
I was sentenced to 10 years in prison the last and final time I went to prison. So I've served 3 state sentences, 3 county sentences, and I was in and out of county jail, Nashua Street, throughout all of that. Okay. So the sentence that you know about, that was the last and final time. And that's when I was sentenced to 10 years, and I served just about 9 years.
And what were you sentenced for?
Illegal possession of a firearm.
Okay. And during this time, your girlfriend at the time was pregnant.
Well, we weren't girlfriend and boyfriend. But yes, my child's mother was pregnant. She was 8.5 months pregnant when I was arrested.
And what was your mindset then?
I just wanted to be in the streets doing what I was doing.
Okay. It's so unfortunate that we're getting a lot of static tonight, because your journey is so powerful. So now you're sentenced to 10 years in jail. The person you were with at the time is pregnant. And you know you're going away, so you're not going to be there for the birth of your child. What was your mindset like then? Now that you're, in a sense, everything's caught up to you. You've been in and out, but this is a long stretch that you have to serve some time. What was going on with you then mentally?
So first and foremost, I had to get through the time. Because it's not like I'm in a situation where I'm doing 6 months, 10 months, I'm sentenced to 10 years. So the first thing that I always do when I went to prison was establish a routine. And that routine for me was usually reading, writing, studying, reading every book. I love learning. And so, but in specific terms around Christian. So Christian was born 2 weeks after I was arrested. His mom brought him up when he was 10 days old and 14 days old. And then I saw him again twice when he was 2 years old. And then I wouldn't see him again until I came home when he was almost 9. But it wasn't until the 6th year that fatherhood. So I had woke up one on the wall and I looked at the picture and it really hit me like on a very deep, internal, visceral, physical level that my son didn't ask to be here, so I owed him better. And it was a thought that I had never had before. So by this time in the sentence, I knew I would never come back to prison again. So I had been slowly addressing the mental health from about the age of 18. But the reality of any journey is until you have the tools to change the next step in front of you, you're going to repeat some of the same patterns. It's just what comes with life. So I've made many mistakes, and relapsing into depression for me usually came in the form of being violent to somebody else, which usually meant I was back in jail again. And so I knew at this point in the sentence that I was not going to come back to jail or to prison. I knew it. I don't know why I knew it. I just knew it. I knew I had grown mentally beyond the feelings that would ever attract me back to such places. Because I loved prison. It was very structured. It was very predictable. And that's what I needed. I needed to be able to predict in order not to have to see all the threats that I used to have to look out for as a little boy. And so the biggest question that I had for myself was, what kind of dad was I going to be? Because there's the choice. And so my first thinking was, well, I'll just be what my dad wasn't. And then it really hit me that if I raise my son with any sort of thoughts of my father in mind, then I'd be doing my son a disservice, because I'm not my dad and my son is not me. He's his own individual and I need to adapt. And so it was in the 6th year that all of this started coming up for me, the fatherhood piece. But what's interesting is every week for the 8.5 years, I wrote him a letter. So he literally had a box full of letters. I would write him a letter, but it would just be part of my routine. It would be part of my prison routine. I would tell him about my day. There would be no emotion involved. It was very robotic. But I did have a sense of duty, but I was very scared at the same time. And so, so before I went to prison, I always told myself the streets would be me knowing I was having a child. Total illusion, total delusion. This is what I actually believed. I believed that once I found out a woman was pregnant by me, it was somehow gonna like the light switch, change my thinking into becoming some sort of father figure. When the reality is, you're going to live out your pattern until you change that pattern.
Yeah.
And so once I found out she was pregnant, I wasn't even there for most of the prenatal period. There's many things that now, if I went through these situations, I would do so much differently. But I was scared. I was uninformed. I didn't know what to do. So I panicked. And when I panic, I typically go back to the things that are most easy to do. And that was just going right back into the streets. And well, because I can't cope with being a dad, I'm going to make everybody out here feel that much more pain because of it.
Wow. So fast forward, and I know you said jail in some way is like a comfort zone to speak, because it's the structure you need. You're not in the streets,
The streets themselves were a structure as well. It was just a different sort.
Okay.
Yes.
So once you're faced with, okay, you've served your 9 years, now you're going back to the streets. What was your priority? What was your mindset as far as what are you going to do now? You're going home to a son you don't know.
So my priority was continue working on my mental health, which has always been my priority. Nothing that I do directly is because of Christian. Christian has inspired me to do some things, but this journey is mine and mine alone. And from there, I can radiate outwards to everybody, Christian being first and foremost. So when I first came home, so I did what they called was a step down program, sort of a halfway house. So every other time I had been to prison, I was released from being what they call behind the wall, which would be a level 4 security or higher. This time I was phased out. It came it was staggered. So the last place that I was in, I could go to work. I could go to my own doctor's appointments. I I could do community things, but I just had to sleep at this place. And if I messed up, I would go back to jail. So that was a big benefit for me because I was already in a mindset where I knew that I wasn't coming back. I just didn't know what I was going to do pretty much with anything. But I was mentally healthy enough to take some of the impact of the stress of not being out for so long. So working on the mental health piece is still the biggest component to everything that I do. And so what ended up happening was I come home, I see Christian. So in the beginning, Christian, it was very, very much a process. So, excuse me. So it went from Christian being comfortable, being around me for 15 minutes. Then it turned into 30 minutes. And this is over the space of weeks and months. And eventually he could spend 4 hours with me. And then what ended up happening is there was one night, Christian was with me, and there was a snowstorm, like literally out of the blue. So it wasn't safe to drive. So Christian had to sleep over. He was forced to. And so in movies, and when it was time to go to bed, he didn't want to go to bed. And so for those who don't know, my son's on the autism spectrum. He was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. It's all lumped into autism now, but he's very high functioning. Where he struggles with is a lot of the social sort of cues. So in a funny, messed up way, we could be at somebody's wake or funeral, and he could look at the body and be like, they could have done a better job with the makeup. Something that we would probably all agree with, but just not in that moment. So to give an idea of sort of the social awareness, he's much better now, but that was at this point in time, that was one of the major struggles. And so he has to sleep over. There's a snowstorm. We're watching movies. Now it's time to go to bed. So so now I can see that anxiety's building in him. He begins kind of like flailing his arms. People familiar with autism have probably seen this many times. And I'm like, Christian, it's time for bed. He's like, Dad, I don't want to. So eventually he told me that he didn't want to go to bed because he was afraid he would wet the bed. And I said, okay, that's fine. I mean, if that happened, it'd be fine. So he was like, well, can we just sleep on the floor instead, just in case? And I'm like, yeah, sure. So we lay on the floor, we fall asleep. I get woken up in the middle of the night, and he's crying and he's very upset. And he's like, I peed the bed. See, this is why. And he starts downing himself. And I had never heard him do this. So something that I did not want to do when I came home. So many men and women who have done a lot of time tend to want to run aspects of their household the same way the COs ran the cell block. And I didn't want to be one of those people. So what I promised myself I would do with my son is I would not judge him for anything. I would observe him. I would watch him because it was his choice to allow me back into his life. He didn't have to do that. He was already 9 years old. He's already his own individual. He could have said, Dad, I don't want to do this. And I would have had to respect that and just did what I could financially. And anytime I could, try to convince him otherwise, take advantage of the opportunity. But he allowed me to be in his life. And I want people to understand that he allowed that. It wasn't something that I could force. And so he wakes up in the middle of the night. He wet the bed. He has anxiety through the roof. And he's doing a lot of negative self-talk. And I'm in my head like, what the hell is going on right now? And so I calmed him down. We did breathing techniques. Something I did once I learned that he was diagnosed with autism, I started really educating myself on it. And a lot of the things necessary to help calm a child down when they're going through episodes. And so we did breathing techniques, we talked, and I told him, I said, Christian. So I told him to go. He went and took a shower. He comes back. And when he came back, I was laying in the wet spot. And so I told him to lay down beside in the wet spot. And I told him, because that's all this is a wet spot. This has absolutely nothing to do with my love for you. There is nothing. You wet the bed because it was natural and part of nature and biology for you to do that. That's it. And that was a turning point in our relationship. He became much more open to talking about. He became much more physical with me. Prior to that, he would give me hugs, but they would be kind of hesitant if I get too. But that night was such a pivotal moment that he opened up. And ever since then, we've been inseparable.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I can see so many people learning from that. And that was just your instincts as a dad wanting to connect with your dad, your son, and support.
No, it was not just my instinct, because I had no fatherhood instinct. It was the work that I did on myself to be open to new ways of dealing with certain things. So I was able to talk to my son that way because I had learned to talk to myself that way. So these were tools and strategies that I was already using with myself. The dad instinct shows itself differently for me. So, and I know we're coming up on time. So wait, I'll let you guide it, because I feel like this. I mean,
Go ahead. Go ahead. I want to hear from you. Go ahead.
So the dad instinct shows up for me a little bit differently. And it shows up more of a protective love measure. And what I mean by that is, so for those who don't know, in 2017, I went and picked my son up for Christmas vacation. He was living in Georgia at the time with his mom and his siblings. I went and picked him up for Christmas vacation. We drive back to Boston, and we got home probably around 11:30. And like at 11:58, I get a text from his mom. And basically what it said is, I'm really tired. Keep him. And that's obviously my world changed. And I remember when I got the text, I just started crying because I had no clue what to do. I mean, no clue. It was very easy visiting him a few times a week, taking him places, spending time with him. That was very easy to do. But I understood the magnitude of making the choice to take him on full time. And I mean, it was a choice. It wasn't something that I had to do, but I wanted to. And so I called my uncle, the uncle that has always been there. And I remember when he answered the phone, I couldn't stop crying. And all I kept saying was, I don't want to fail this boy. That's all I kept saying. I don't want to fail this boy. And I had no clue what that would look like, no clue how to begin the process. So what I ended up doing was I began a page on Facebook called the One Day at a Time Dad. And the page no longer exists now, but it was created for others to tell me how to be a parent. I was asking any and everybody for parenting advice. And what I ended up learning was that the best source of learning how to be a parent was letting my son teach me how to be a parent. And that came through developing those fatherhood instincts where I listen to him. I'm open to what he's saying. I'm affectionate towards him. I'm firm with him. So my parenting style is very laid back but firm. So I personally want my son to go through appropriate mental and emotional struggles because I want him to become adapted and adjusted to all sorts of situations. The only situations I don't put him in is something that is harmful. So I'm all for my son learning, but I make it very clear that I am willing and available to help you work through whatever you want to work through. And you can come to me about anything. Very important for me. But the way that many people look at the bond my son and I have now, and they think that I raised him on my own since birth. And it's not that. It's just that with so much of the mental health work I did with myself, it opened me up to being available to new things. And my son was a new thing. And so my son has taught me more about being a parent than anybody has. Like, he doesn't even know how grateful I am for him. And, and so what's interesting was, so he moves in full time. And like I said, I had no clue what to do. The Facebook page. And within like a few months, it had it was just, I had always had a passion for motivational speaking, telling my story. I didn't know how to do so yet, but I was always in contact with brothers and sisters from the prisons, from the street, and I always would try to mentor them. Yet when Christian moved in, the instinct to do that became much sharper. And the reason was because I began to understand that it was not enough to just love my son. Part of loving my son meant loving you and your sons, because your sons could very well kill my son. So I have to love your child as a part of loving my child. And that was more so the instinctual part of parenting, where I understood that part of the healing and part of the cycle breaking for not myself, but for the larger picture, was that my love for this being had to be extended to all beings. And that was the instinctual lesson that I really learned. That higher form of protecting my son by protecting and loving the neighborhood. Because it made no sense to me to raise my son in an environment that could easily just take him out. And my son's 14 years old. I know what I was doing at 14 years old. And I know how many people like me were doing it at 14 years old and younger.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I am so glad that you and your son have connected on such a level. And so tell us where you are now. What projects are you working on in this community?
Yep. So currently, I do a podcast series called Listening to Learn. I interview community members of all backgrounds, and the mission statement is discovering solutions to community issues through the voices of lived experience. So I do the podcast series. You can go on the website, listeningtolearnmedia.com. You can go on Listening to Learn on Facebook. In terms of what I do concretely, besides that, I collaborate with the Department of Public Health, the Center for Disease Control, and the Children's Trust, which are organizations in Massachusetts, city and state departments, working around, it's called Essentials for Childhood. And it works to maintain, protect, and create new ways for safe, healthy, and nurturing families. And so I collaborate with city officials, state officials, and then in my spare time, I'm going back into the streets like I always do, and just constantly communicating and connecting with people, sharing my story, letting them know that it's a hard journey to undertake when you're talking about changing your mind, but that the reward of it is going to be better than they ever could imagine. And so it's more so a matter for me of bringing awareness. Like, you know, I have a picture with a shirt on that says from single cell to single dad. So much of my mission is cycle breaking generational curse, breaking the generational cycles, awareness of these cycles, how it could possibly look to talk about this awareness. I most certainly know that one of my gifts is being able to articulate my experience, which happens to be the experience of so many other people. So I feel a duty in a way to share that experience. So I try to share it in as many platforms as I can, because I know everybody won't connect to my story. We all have our own biases. We all have everything. But if you tell your story and it's the same as my story, maybe they'll connect to you. And if they don't connect to you, maybe they'll connect to the person you shared your story with. And hopefully it catches on. That's sort of my goal.
Thank you. I do appreciate you joining me tonight. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
I really appreciate this opportunity. And I really want to bring us back to kind of what we started talking about when we talk about the sexual violations. You know, I really just want to say once again, we're talking about the violation of children. It's not girl, boy, there's no gender involved. It's children that needed protection from people who didn't even believe they deserved love. So I just want to say again, especially for men, if you have experienced these sorts of abuses, please try a way to talk to somebody you trust about it. And this is society across all countries. If they made it more acceptable for men to experience feeling, because people seem to think that men shouldn't feel particular ways, whatever the case may be. Look, I'm extremely assertive. I'm extremely strong. I'm all of these things. We're all, while other things get pushed to the light. And for many men, the toxicness of the manliness is what we were taught to be. And I just want to say that learning to show affection and accept affection will make you a better man than you ever could think of. And you showing that affection to your children will make them better men and women than they could ever be.
Thank you. And thank you everyone that tuned in tonight. We certainly appreciate you. So on behalf of Christian and myself, Dawn Wilson on the Caribbean Edge, thank you for joining us. Please share this episode as it will touch so many lives. And Christina, looks like we're going to have to do a small segment because we lost a lot due to a bad connection there.
Oh, yeah, that's probably totally my fault. My internet's just really acting up. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you once again for your time and for sharing with us this evening.
You're very welcome. Have a wonderful evening.